August 4th, 1943, Norfolk, Virginia. The ship's hold stank of sweat and salt water. Corporal Klaus Miller stood shoulder to shoulder with 300 German prisoners, breathing the thick air of 14 days at sea. Through propaganda films and whispered warnings, they knew what awaited them. Americans were savages who took no mercy on the defeated. The Reich had shown them footage of bombed cities, starving civilians, a nation barely holding itself together. They had been told to expect torture, starvation, camps worse than anything Germany had designed. The engines shuddered silent. Footsteps echoed above. American voices called out orders in sharp, foreign syllables. This was it. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, if you're enjoying this journey through history, please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss future videos. And drop a comment below letting us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community around the world. The hatch opened. Sunlight poured down the stairs like water, blinding after 2 weeks of darkness. Klaus climbed toward it, his legs unsteady, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had prepared himself for violence. He had steeled himself for cruelty. What he saw in his first 24 hours on American soil shattered every certainty more completely than any Allied bomb ever could. And in that moment, standing on the dock with Virginia stretching green and whole before him, he realized everything the Reich had told him was a lie. The metal gangplank descended with a groan. Klaus stepped onto American soil, the wooden dock weathered gray by ocean spray. An MP stood at the bottom, rifle slung casually over his shoulder. Klaus braced himself, waited for the shout, waited for the blow. The MP yawned. He checked his wristwatch like a man bored with routine. Another guard nearby cracked a joke Klaus couldn't understand, and both men laughed. No one hit anyone. No one shouted. The air itself felt wrong. Klaus breathed deep, tasting something he hadn't encountered in months. Freshness, the smell of growing things. Beyond the dock, Virginia stretched in endless green. Trees thick with summer leaves. Buildings standing undamaged against a blue sky. Ships moved in the harbor with casual efficiency. Cranes lifted cargo. Workers called to each other across the docks. In Germany, the cities were burning. Here, nothing burned at all. Friedrich Hahn stood frozen beside him, staring at the shoreline. "Look," he whispered in German. "The buildings. They're not bombed." Klaus looked. Every structure stood complete. Windows reflected morning sun. Warehouses lined the port, their roofs intact, their walls unscratched by war. It was a port in wartime, yet it looked like a port at peace. The propaganda had shown them footage of American cities in ruins. They'd been told Allied bombing had devastated the industrial centers, that America was starving, barely holding itself together. But here stood proof otherwise. The MPs gestured them toward processing. Klaus expected interrogation, perhaps torture disguised as questioning. Instead, they were given forms. An American clerk with wire-rimmed glasses sat at a folding table, checking names against a manifest. He looked bored. "Name?" the clerk asked in accented German. "Müller. Klaus Müller." The clerk made a mark. Next. That was it. No threats, no violence, just bureaucracy. They were photographed, fingerprinted, given prisoner numbers. Klaus became POW 315284. The American photographer positioned each man in front of a white sheet and snapped photos with mechanical efficiency. Then came the trains. Klaus stared at them and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. These weren't cattle cars. These weren't the boxcars that had carried them across Europe, packed 50 men deep with no seats and one bucket in the corner. These were passenger cars. Pullman cars with windows and cushioned seats and overhead racks for luggage they didn't have. "Inside," an MP said, not unkindly. "Long ride ahead." Klaus climbed aboard. The interior was clean. The seats had fabric covering, blue and slightly faded. The windows opened. Fresh air moved through the car, carrying the scent of American summer. Klaus sat down and felt the cushion give beneath him. Beside him, Otto Werner touched the armrest with tentative care. "This is a passenger train," Otto whispered. "They're putting us on a passenger train." Friedrich ran his hand along the window frame. "In Germany, I rode to the front in a boxcar. 50 men, 3 days. No seats. We took turns leaning against the walls to sleep." The train lurched and began to move. Through the windows, Virginia passed by in a stream of green. Fields rolled past, unplowed by tank treads. Farmhouses stood whole. Barns held their roofs. Cows grazed in pastures like the world wasn't at war. Children played in a yard, and one looked up to wave at the passing train. Klaus waved back before he could stop himself. The cognitive dissonance was crushing. Every piece of evidence before his eyes contradicted everything he'd been taught. America was supposed to be weak, starving, barely holding itself together. Instead, he was riding through a landscape of abundance so complete it seemed obscene. The train rolled through morning and into afternoon. One guard stopped beside Klaus's seat and offered cigarettes around. American cigarettes. Klaus took one, his hands shaking slightly. The guard lit it for him with a Zippo that clicked open with practiced ease. Klaus drew smoke into his lungs and tasted real tobacco. Not ersatz, not mixed with sawdust or dried leaves. By the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war had to be fed the same rations as the captor nation's troops, housed in adequate shelter, and treated with basic human dignity. But between law and practice lay an ocean of interpretation. The Germans knew this. They'd seen how rules could be bent, broken, ignored when convenient. Yet here the Americans were, following the letter and spirit of the convention. More than following it, exceeding it. Sometime in the afternoon, the train stopped at a small town for water. The prisoners were allowed to step onto the platform to stretch their legs. A woman appeared. American, middle-aged. She carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth. She approached the nearest guard, spoke to him briefly, then began handing out sandwiches to the prisoners. Klaus took one, staring at it like an artifact from another world. White bread, ham, cheese, lettuce. "Eat," she said in German, the word heavily accented but unmistakable. "You must be hungry." Klaus bit into the sandwich. The bread was soft. The ham was real. He chewed slowly, and around him, other prisoners did the same. All of them silent. All of them trying to process what was happening. Otto stood beside him, eating his sandwich with tears running down his face. Not from sadness, from the sheer incomprehensibility of kindness from an enemy. The train whistle blew. They reboarded. Through the window, Klaus watched America unspool in an endless reel of normalcy. Gas stations with cars waiting for fuel. Grocery stores with people walking out carrying bags full of food. Churches with white steeples pointing toward a sky that held no bombers. Friedrich leaned across the aisle. "Do you remember the films they showed us in training?" Klaus remembered. Films of Americans torturing prisoners. Films of cities in chaos. Films designed to make surrender seem worse than death. "I remember." "They lied," Friedrich said quietly, "about everything." Klaus didn't answer. He was too busy watching American children playing baseball in a field beside the tracks, their laughter audible even over the train's rattle. In Germany, children hid in bunkers. Here they played games. Evening approached. The train slowed. Through the window, Klaus saw buildings appear. Wooden structures, freshly built, stretching across cleared land. Guard towers punctuated the perimeter. Barbed wire caught the late afternoon light. A sign at the entrance read Camp Hearn in white letters against dark wood. The train hissed to a stop. They filed off onto a gravel platform. Texas heat wrapped around Klaus like a blanket he couldn't shed. Before him stretched the compound, and despite the wire and towers, something about it looked wrong for a prison camp. Too organized, too new. American soldiers waited to receive them. But their demeanor puzzled Klaus. No shouting, no rifles pointed. One sergeant actually helped an older prisoner down from the train car, catching his elbow when he stumbled. Processing began immediately. A medical officer examined each man. Klaus was directed to remove his shirt. The American doctor, a captain with gray threading through his brown hair, pressed a stethoscope against Klaus's chest, checked his eyes, his throat, his ears. He discovered the poorly healed shrapnel wound on Klaus's shoulder and frowned. "This should have had stitches," he said in careful German. "You'll have a bad scar." He cleaned the wound with alcohol that stung, applied fresh bandages with practiced gentleness, and made a note on a chart. Klaus stood there shirtless in an enemy medical facility, receiving better care than he'd gotten from his own field medics. The doctor handed him a slip of paper. "Report to the infirmary tomorrow. We'll check the healing." Outside, twilight was falling. The prisoners were led toward the barracks. Klaus walked with Otto and Friedrich, following an American corporal whose rifle remained slung over his shoulder, unthreatening. They passed what looked like a kitchen building, and through the open door came smells that made Klaus's stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. Meat cooking, bread baking, real food. The barracks loomed ahead. The corporal gestured them inside. "Find a bunk," he said in broken German. "Dinner in 1 hour." Klaus stepped into the barracks and stopped. The other prisoners behind him stopped too, creating a bottleneck at the door. The barracks was clean, newly built. It smelled of fresh pine and disinfectant. And down each side, in 2 neat rows, stood beds. Metal-framed beds with mattresses, with sheets, with pillows. Otto made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Beds," he whispered. "They've given us beds." Klaus walked to the nearest unoccupied bunk and sat on it. The mattress compressed beneath him. Springs creaked softly. He ran his hand over the sheet. It was thin, institutional, but it was clean. A folded blanket sat at the foot of the bed. He lay back, staring at the ceiling. Felt springs supporting his body instead of dirt or metal floor. Friedrich claimed the bunk above Klaus. "I spent 6 months sleeping on the ground," he said quietly. "Before that, train floors. Before that, a tent in rain. I haven't slept in a bed since I left Munich." Around them, other prisoners were doing the same thing, sitting on beds, touching sheets. One older man, a sergeant named Hans who rarely spoke, sat on his bunk and wept quietly, his face in his hands. The hour passed. A whistle blew. The corporal appeared. "Dinner time. Follow me." They walked to the mess hall. The building was larger than Klaus expected, with long tables and benches and windows that let in the last of the evening light. The serving line began at one end of the hall. Klaus took a metal tray from a stack, picked up utensils, shuffled forward. Behind a counter, American cooks in white aprons ladled food onto trays. The first cook dropped a piece of fried chicken onto Klaus's tray. The second added mashed potatoes with a pool of brown gravy in the center. The third spooned green beans beside the potatoes. The fourth placed 2 slices of white bread with pats of butter on the tray's edge. At the end of the line, pitchers of milk sat on a table, cold and sweating in the heat. Klaus carried his tray to a table and sat. He stared at the food. Otto sat beside him, staring at his own tray. Friedrich sat across from them. None of them made a move to eat. "This isn't real," Otto finally said. "It is real," Friedrich replied, "which means everything else was a lie." Klaus picked up his fork, cut into the chicken. Steam rose from the meat. He took a bite, chewed slowly, tasted fat and salt and seasoning, and understood that he was eating better food as a prisoner of war than he had eaten as a soldier in the Wehrmacht. Better food than his family was eating in Stuttgart. Better food, possibly, than he had ever eaten in his life. Around Klaus, German prisoners confronted a shocking reality: abundance in captivity. The mess hall buzzed with quiet, stunned eating. Some men ate mechanically, faces blank. Others savored each bite. A few couldn't eat at all. Hans, an older sergeant, sat staring at his full tray. "I'm thinking about my daughter," he said softly. "She had soup for dinner, potato peels and water, and I'm here looking at fried chicken." Guilt battled hunger, but eventually he ate. Afterward, they toured the camp. Latrines were clean with running water. Showers had hot water hotter than Klaus had felt in 2 years. He shivered under it, feeling sweat, fear, and travel grime wash away. As August turned to September, prisoners adapted. Some worked maintenance, others labored on farms. With young American men overseas, the War Department used POW labor, paying 80 cents per day in script. Locals grumbled about Fritz Ritz hotels, angry over prisoners' abundance while Americans rationed. Klaus volunteered for field work. The truck carried them 20 miles to a cotton farm where the owner, a weathered man named Curtis Whitfield, stood waiting with his hat pulled low against the morning glare. "You boys ever picked cotton?" Curtis asked. No one had. Curtis showed them how. The motion of pulling the bolls without crushing them. The way to work a row without trampling the plants. The work was hard. The sun climbed and the heat increased and Klaus's back began to ache. But there was rhythm to it, a simplicity that was almost peaceful after years of war. At noon, Curtis's wife brought lunch in a pickup truck, the bed loaded with thermoses and baskets. Klaus expected to eat apart from the Americans, under guard. Instead, Curtis waved them under a live oak. "Come on, food's getting cold," he said. They sat together, Germans and Americans, prisoners and guards. Curtis's wife served sandwiches thick with ham and cheese, pickles, potato chips, and lemonade. Klaus drank 3 glasses. She refilled each time without comment. "You boys speak English?" Curtis asked. "Some," Klaus said. "Where you from?" "Stuttgart." They ate in silence for a moment. Curtis said, "My son's over there in France, fighting your countrymen." Klaus didn't know what to say. "I am sorry," he tried. "Not your fault. War's war. Politicians start them. Young men die in them. Been that way since Cain and Abel." Curtis finished his sandwich. "Back to work, boys. Cotton won't pick itself." That evening, Klaus rode in the truck bed, watching Texas pass by. The guard offered cigarettes. They smoked in silence. "Not so bad, is it?" "No," Klaus said finally, thinking of lemonade, of Curtis's wife serving without fear, of Curtis sharing lunch with his enemy. "Not so bad." By October, routine had settled. The camp offered education, math, English, agriculture. Friedrich Hahn enrolled in every class he could. Before the war, he'd studied philosophy. Otto Werner took English from Mrs. Campbell, a retired schoolteacher who corrected pronunciation patiently and praised genuine progress. She brought books and newspapers showing the war from the American side. Factories producing tanks and planes faster than Germany could destroy them. One November evening, she stayed after class. "You're bright. What will you do after the war?" Otto hadn't thought that far ahead. "I will go home, to Munich, to my family." And then? He didn't know. "You could come back," she said. "America needs men willing to build instead of destroy." December brought cooler weather and Christmas decorations. Some prisoners found it offensive, others necessary. Home was a year away, maybe more. Not all camps were peaceful. On November 4, 1943, at Camp Tonkawa, a German corporal, Johannes Kunze, was beaten to death by prisoners for cooperating with Americans. On December 17, 1943, at Camp Hearn, Corporal Hugo Kraus met the same fate. The murders shocked the camps. American authorities intervened. Klaus, Otto, and Friedrich learned that even in abundance, the war's ideology persisted. Yet life went on. Curtis brought lemonade. Mrs. Campbell taught. Meals continued 3 times a day. Slowly, certainty and fear cracked. May 1945. The war in Europe ended. Hitler was dead. Germany surrendered. Klaus read a letter from his mother. She and his sister were alive, living on a farm outside Stuttgart. Their house was destroyed, food scarce. He was safe, well-fed, under a roof, while they survived in ruins. The guilt was enormous. The prisoners stayed. President Truman kept them working. Klaus wanted to go home and stay at once, torn between 2 worlds. By summer 1946, repatriation began. Klaus was scheduled to leave in August. On his last day, Curtis drove him to the farm. Lunch was fried chicken, the same as his first day. They ate under the live oak. "You ever change your mind?" Curtis asked. "Write me. I'll help." Klaus nodded. That evening, Curtis shook his hand. "You're a good man, Klaus. Don't matter where you were born." At Bremerhaven, Klaus stepped into ruins. He found his mother and sister outside Stuttgart. "What was it like?" his sister asked. "In America." Klaus set down his spoon. "Not what we were told," he said. He rebuilt, married, returned to Texas in 1955, one of thousands who found kindness where they expected cruelty. Otto Werner became a U.S. citizen in 1958 and opened a bakery. Friedrich Hahn finished his philosophy degree at the University of Texas and taught for 30 years. Curtis Whitfield's son returned from France in 1945. Curtis farmed until his death in 1972. Klaus wept at his funeral, remembering the man who showed him forgiveness. The camps are gone. Barracks were torn down, sold, repurposed. Monuments remain, marking where prisoners learned their enemies were human. Otto Werner later said, "We were trained to believe Americans were weak and decadent. Then they gave us beds and steak and treated us with respect. That broke Nazism in our hearts more effectively than any bomb." Klaus told students in 1980, "On my first day in America, I expected to be shot. Instead, I was given a pillow. Everything I'd been told was a lie. Understanding that took the rest of my life. The sun still rises over Texas. Fields still grow cotton. The sky remains wide. Somewhere in letters and diaries the story endures. Men who crossed an ocean expecting death and found instead a second chance at life."